Harrison with you. This is Harrison on the Edge. You can follow us anytime on Twitter at GoHarrison. Also Facebook, keyword, the Cary Harrison. I'm going to tell you about an extraordinary letter to the president that has been written by more than 24 ex-U.S. intelligence officers urging President Trump to please rethink his claims, blaming the Syrian government for the chemical deaths and to pull back from his dangerous escalation of tensions with Russia. How dangerous? Seriously dangerous. Point number 2, they point out, and this is really key before we get to our guest, former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer Phil Giraldi. Point number 2, our U.S. Army contacts in the area have told us this is not what happened. There was no Syrian chemical weapons attack. Instead, a Syrian aircraft bombed an al-Qaeda in Syria ammunition depot that turned out to be full of noxious chemicals, and a strong wind blew that chemical-laden cloud over a nearby village where many consequently died. That's what we have from the internal military, U.S. military side of things. Now let's pivot over to Phil Giraldi, former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer, spending 20 years overseas in Europe and the Middle East working terrorism cases. So let's talk about this memorandum for the president, for Donald Trump, from the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS. The subject was Syria. Was it really a chemical weapons attack?
To be more specific, there's no clear evidence that if there was a chemical weapons attack, it was carried out by the Syrian government, which is really the crucial issue here, because we then went to war with Syria as a result of what we thought had occurred. That's the central issue.
We don't often get to hear from former CIA case officers, Army intelligence officers. We hear sort of acting military guys who seem to be pushing toward war, exacerbating tensions between Korea, Russia, all the rest of it. We are looking at potential nuclear war here. Certainly, the Koreans just announced, just within the last couple of days, that if tensions continue to escalate, they were prepared to do something, whatever that might be. These are not kids in the sandbox, though Mr. Trump is treating them like they're all sort of silly children over there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the real danger here. I mean, we're not talking about a bunch of cruise missiles hitting an air base in Syria in revenge for something that may or may not have occurred. The question really is here is, do we really need to change our relationship with Russia in particular, because Russia is a country that has the capability to destroy us? Is it necessary to provoke North Korea at a time when North Korea could do terrible damage to its neighbors, Japan and South Korea? Why are we doing these things? So the suspicion is developing that we're doing these things for political reasons, because the current administration believes that this is something that will make it more popular, to put it that way.
I was just going to ask, what's the end game here? And if the end game is just to win a popularity contest like a teenage girl in high school, there's serious problems here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about wars, even if it's a regional war, using even conventional weapons. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people killed, maybe more than that, and if it escalates into something that relies on nuclear weapons, then of course we're talking that those numbers are magnified by a factor of 10 or 100. So it's it's a serious stuff. And my dismay last week when the president basically got up and said, "Oh yes, we know that Syria has done this terrible thing. It's killed all these little babies and these children." I knew at that point, as a former intelligence officer, that he had no way in that time span of knowing what he was saying. He was saying something for political reasons with the impact that he knew it would make. And it really, in no way, was connected to what the intelligence community could have possibly known at that point. So the whole thing is quite scary.
We're talking to Phil Giraldi, former CIA case officer, Army intelligence officer who spent 20 years overseas in Europe and the Middle East working terrorism cases, currently executive director of the Council for the National Interest. And we're taking a look at the saber rattling, but it's not sort of invisibly happening. There are huge Herculean possibilities, not good ones, that could happen from a guy who, like his daughter Ivanka Trump, who apparently now we learn was pushing Donald Trump to fire those 59 Tomahawk missiles. Turns out he also has preferred stock in Raytheon that manufactures them. And right after firing them, their stock increased by $100 million, which he, of course, took the pleasure in making a healthy profit. All of that may be an unknown side effect, but she certainly knew because she's managing part of his investments. All of this stuff kind of gets back to the Smedley Butler part of war is a racket, going back to World War I.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the Smedley Butler war is a racket seems more and more appropriate to everything in relationship to everything that's been happening since 9/11. We had, going back to 2003, we had the invasion of Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist and were never discovered, and never discovered because they did not exist. So, this is not a new thing. And then we had the last time we had a panic over Syria, where the Obama administration was claiming that Syria had used chemical weapons on its population. It turned out that was a complete sham, that the people who had used the chemical weapons were actually the rebels, and the chemical weapons had been provided by our good ally in the Middle East, Turkey. So, these issues are very complicated, and the people that are basically pushing us towards greater confrontation with Syria, with Russia, they have their own agendas.
Harrison with you. This is Harrison on the Edge. We're talking right now to Phil Giraldi, former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer, having spent 20 years overseas in Europe, in the Middle East, working on terrorism cases, currently executive director of the Council for the National Interest. You could follow us anytime on Twitter @GoHarrison, @GoHarrison. Also on Facebook, keyword Go Harrison or Cary Harrison. And I know Phil stays away from social media like poison, avoids it all, does not tweet, and does not drink Chardonnay under any circumstances. Point 5 in your memorandum to Donald Trump, signed by many of you, scholars, CIA analysts, et al., and we're talking about more than 24 U.S. intelligence officials urging Donald Trump to rethink his claims, blaming the Syrian government for the chemical deaths, and to pull back from this dangerous escalation of tensions with Russia. Point number 5 that you all wrote and signed is that after Putin persuaded Assad in 2013 to give up his chemical weapons, the U.S. Army destroyed 600 metric tons of Syria's chemical weapon stockpiles in just 6 weeks. The mandate of the United Nations Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons was to ensure that all were destroyed, like the mandate for the UN inspectors for Iraq regarding the famous WMD. The UN inspectors' findings on WMD were the truth. Rumsfeld and his generals lied, and this seems to be happening again. I know a lot of us are clutching our pearls like, wait a minute, Donald Trump would be prevaricating, would be making stuff up. This is just, please. You guys must have been sitting back from the beginning going, oh my God, we already know how the script is gonna play out.
Well, to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, a lot of us were hoping against hope that Donald Trump would go back to the things he promised when he was running for office, which was essentially that he would not get involved in the Middle East, that he would try to restore relations with Russia to a functional level. But all of a sudden, we see that whole kind of charade collapsing. It's a shame. I mean, we keep seeing the replay of the same movie, which is we don't have any evidence, but trust us, and we'll tell you what we want you to believe. And we've seen that with RussiaGate. We've seen that, as I said, in terms of Iraq, and now we're seeing it again. And it's just like, how many times do we have to be fooled? I'm not saying for a second that Syria did not do this, although they had no motive whatsoever to do it. But the fact is, let's see the evidence. The United States has that entire region of the world saturated with surveillance satellites that see everything that goes on. I am absolutely certain that the United States has a video of exactly what went down. When are we going to see that?
Now, you're a former CIA case officer. You have been on the inside. You were there during the Iran hostage crisis. So boots on the ground, eyes on the ground. You know what's going on here. I just wonder why I just forgot what I was going to ask you.
Happens to me, too.
Yes. So maybe I'll ask you something different so that I sound fairly intelligent here. Point number 2 is our U.S. Army contacts in the area have told us that this is not what happened, that Assad did not, in fact, use chemical weapons. There was no Syrian chemical weapons attack. Instead, a Syrian aircraft bombed an al-Qaeda in Syria ammunition depot that turned out to be full of noxious chemicals. Strong wind, of course, blowing those chemical-laden clouds over a nearby village where many consequently died. Let's just make an analogy. Let's say that Germany decided to fire cruise missiles at the United States because we played a song they didn't like, or we treated the Indians badly on a reservation. Wouldn't we then view that as a serious act of war?
Sure, absolutely, we would, and that's what's so disturbing as the bottom line of all this. And because Syria, whether we like it or not, has a legitimate government, and the legitimate government has been fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda for a number of years now. And here, in this instance, we've staged an act of war, an attack on Syria, without Syria being declared as an enemy by Article 2 of our own Constitution, where Congress is supposed to declare war. We're not at war with Syria. So there are very fundamental issues in terms of constitutionalism, in terms of presidential power, that we should be looking at here. This attack, with the cruise missiles, cost the taxpayer $100 million, which I think is serious enough. But the fact is, it didn't kill anybody. It hardly did much damage. But to do this just to send a message is unconscionable.
Unless you're a mafiosa, then it's probably a really effective plan. And you're a CIA case officer, Army intelligence officer. You've been through multiple presidencies here. Has there ever been a president, in your knowledge, who's fired Tomahawk missiles over cocktails and steaks?
Well, there's only been one that's actually fired Tomahawk missiles to cover up for things that they were doing, and that was Bill Clinton, of course, when he attacked Afghanistan and also Sudan. But Trump is in a category all by himself. I mean, this seems to have been a decision. We don't really know yet who pushed for this, but it seems to be a decision to do this that came straight out of the White House.
I know your time is tight. I want to respect that and just sort of end up with the kind of the big question. Not that you have the absolute answer here, but just your sense, having been a CIA case officer and an Army intelligence officer, this dalliance with Russia. It looks like the largest single investor in Trump's financial operations happen to be Russian oligarchs and the Russians themselves. I suppose if somebody had lent me a pile of money, I might have favorable attitudes toward them. Is a lot of this just make-believe? It's hard to wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the real answer is it is hard to wrap our heads around it. The fact is that in our government, for as long as we can go back, corruption has been a major element in how everything works. Congress is corrupt. The presidency itself is always owes favors to various constituencies that the president relies on to get elected, and so we have a persistent pattern of corruption. And Americans don't like to think of our system that way, but this is far worse than if you take a bus in Bangladesh and the guy wants you to bribe him, $1 to give you a better seat. This is a corruption that is pervasive, and it's something that comes out of our political system, and it comes out of our banking system, which is where all the money that fuels this comes from. It's something Americans have to start considering if they really want to change the way things happen in this country. And certainly the way we go to war is one of the most awful aspects of how things happen.
Are the intelligence services, are they holding their nose a bit at this president? Do we have hope that they won't all go along with the Kool-Aid that's being dispensed out of a very fast-running spigot? Can we hope for something?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very hard one to answer because, there are 20,000 or so people, maybe more than that, maybe 40,000 people in the intelligence community. And there are all kinds of different people, and they all have different ways of looking at things. Now, the real danger is not those 40,000 or so people. It's the, 150 or so people who are at the top of these organizations who are very political, who are very tied to politicians at various levels for their own careers. And these people are the ones you have to watch out for. I would think the intelligence community is quite happy to work for anyone. But the fact is that these people are the ones that are maneuvering and manipulating the situation. As I understand it, the CIA was not even consulted on this attack on Syria, which is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, but Ivanka was consulted, and she said yes.
That's right. So he went to the most important constituency, right? I understand.
Well, and he also reminded us about a year and a half ago that he would have sex with his own daughters. So I'm satisfied from top to bottom. I want to thank you. I know, there's no comment even possible there.
No, nothing I can say to that one.
I want to thank you so much for joining us. Phil Giraldi is a former CIA case officer and Army intelligence officer who spent 20 years overseas in Europe and the Middle East working terrorism cases, currently executive director of the Council for National Interest, and resides with his wife of 32 years in Virginia horse country, close to his daughters and grandchildren. He has begun talking far too much to his English bulldog Dudley of late, thinks of himself as a gourmet cook, and will not drink Chardonnay under any circumstances. He doesn't tweet and avoids all social media. Bravo to you, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, my friend. We'll do it again.